guest today is Chris Fulbright. He's a sophomore here at Oklahoma State. He is majoring in secondary education social studies. Is that right, Chris?
That is correct.
And can you go ahead and tell me what you were just telling me a second ago about what your major, like the full title of it is?
Yeah. So basically, here at Oklahoma State, that there's two different sections of secondary education and social studies. So for me, I'm secondary education and social studies, focusing in history and geography. But there's a second section that you can decide to major in, that's secondary education and social studies, that focuses in sociology and psychology. So for those psychology teachers that may want to teach in high school, they can go down that route. Be completely different. And whenever I declared my major, I had to specify that I wanted to do the history and geography section.
Right.
Yep.
So do you take, what classes might be different then for you versus someone who's in this other area?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So for me, I'm taking a lot more history classes, right? I get to choose from tons of different topics like American history, world history. I'm also taking way more geography classes than they're going to have to. They will, the other major will specifically take a lot more psychology classes. Like I only had to take intro to psychology, for example. They're going to be going into and delving into like developmental psychology and those tougher psychological classes, and the sociology classes as well, because I also had to take intro to soc. But that's it. That's as far as I needed to go. So I go on and I also take a lot more specific classes relating to if I was going to be teaching here in Oklahoma. So I have to take Oklahoma history, for example, which I'm actually taking this semester, and it's been great so far. But that's really the main two differences between our majors.
I see. Does it at all dictate what you can or can't teach in the future? Does it have any effect on that?
Well, technically, yes. So they wouldn't really be able to teach like a regular history class. Like I'm geared towards teaching like American government. If I teach here in Oklahoma, I'd be qualified to teach Oklahoma history. I'll be able to teach world history. I can also teach United States history. And if I get my credentials, I can teach APUSH, AP US history, and European history. They're going to be more qualified to teach the psychology and sociology classes. Like, for example, I took a psychology class in high school, and their major was, or their qualification was in psychology, so they got that secondary education, social studies, and psychology degree. So.
Awesome. Wow. Okay. So so it has a completely different.
Right.
I see. Well, awesome. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah.
What do you want to talk about today?
I can talk about a lot of different things. I can talk about Oklahoma history and how crazy Oklahoma really is, about how unique we are. But I can also just talk about teaching as well, and how America is kind of suffering a little bit of a teaching crisis. Especially here in Oklahoma, we're 100% having a teaching crisis, and Governor Stitt is not helping very well.
Well, how about let's do this. Start telling me. We'll start talking about Oklahoma history, but
Yeah.
then I want to get into some of this teacher conversation. So
Yeah, absolutely. How about I do one better, and I combine both?
that
I
sounds
can talk about the
fantastic.
history of teaching in Oklahoma.
That sounds fantastic.
Right, and I can actually bring myself into it. I'll start off with a teaching crisis here in Oklahoma, and you'll learn a little bit of the history of it. So basically, you know that at one point Oklahoma was 48th in education.
Right. When was that? How recent was that?
Really recent, 2018 actually. Believe it or not, yeah. And the reason why I know this is because I actually went to the Capitol and spoke about student and teaching issues back in high school. And I talked all about that, and I was there on the Capitol marching around with the teachers, talking about why they need to improve teacher pay and increase pay for past teachers. COLA increasements, those are what they're called, cost of living adjustments, which that's a big problem for teachers in Oklahoma, retired teachers, and also getting increase in pay for our staff and faculty, for the janitorial workers, for the bus drivers, because that's also another thing that Oklahoma is struggling with, is we don't have very many bus drivers, and that can take a toll on a school system. But yeah, it's been since 2018. But really, we've been struggling since the 90s, to be completely honest with you, because there hasn't been a pay increasement up until 2018, until they passed it underneath Mary Fallon. Thank goodness they did, because
when was the last one?
In the 90s.
In the 90s.
Yes,
Okay.
in the 90s. They got the last pay increasement, and there hadn't been one in, I mean, you do the math, 28 years. So what's keeping teachers from staying? Because, they have to provide for their families. But then also, for those who might have had a homeschool education or a public education, private education, who haven't gone through the public education process, you would know that we've been using textbooks that are 30 years old. They haven't been updated, which is insane. I had a textbook that came from Georgia, teaching about Oklahoma history, that was 30 years old. So a Georgian was telling me about Oklahoma from 30 years ago.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Oh, it's great. It's fantastic. But thankfully, it's not that way. But we're still struggling, because really the biggest struggle is that if we're talking about public education, is that public schools are losing their students. Because this goes into the funding, which not very many people really know how funding works for education. To give a basic rundown, I had to write a paper of this. But basically how the funding works is that some of it comes from the state. And if you're in a more risky area, like lower income, is what I mean by that, the federal government can come in and help. But really, you get a lot of your income from ad valorem taxes, from property taxes. And so if you have low ad valorem taxes, you're not paying very well. Your school system's not. But with that, you have the problem of, well, you don't want to increase taxes. How do you get the funding? So you get it from the state, right? But if the state's not increasing funding, it's this vicious cycle of nobody's going to give the funding because nobody wants to increase taxes. So how do you increase the taxes?
I don't know. Is there an answer?
Well, 2018 was the answer. Whenever you have the teachers go out and advocate for the school system, it's quite interesting how that came to be, because in Oklahoma we have so many different issues like healthcare. That was the biggest main proponent. Is like, okay, do we provide for education? Or do we provide for healthcare? And it's like, well, we really shouldn't have to make that choice, right? I don't really have an answer for that, but I know that they tax gambling, which is great. They increased they had a ball and dice tax. They also increased taxes on cigarettes was another way they did that. But then they also discussed about increasing taxes on oil, and I won't get into that because that was the biggest debate that they had. I'll give you a secret, let you in on a secret. I think we should increase our taxes on oil because we produce so much, but that's besides the point.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting to see how we fund education in America. Oh, but going back to how it relates to the students is a school district will get paid out of those ad valorem taxes and those state taxes. They get that funding. It's based on how many students you have in your school, right? So to give you an example, if a school district has 2,000 students in it, right? You get a certain amount of money allocated to that one student. But here comes the problem. That's only at the beginning of the school year, right? So let's say you have 500 students join during the school year.
So
during
not at the
the
beginning. So
school year,
you
not at the
start with a
beginning.
certain number.
You started with 2,000, so
Okay.
they give you the money for 2,000 students, how it should be ran. But
And then you get 500 people that
join.
kind of move to the
Exactly.
area.
Move to the school district. They come on in. You have no funding for them. So how are you supposed to be able to provide that education? Because they don't have that funding allocated, right? And here's another big problem with charter schools and private education is students will leave the public school systems because they see either their parents think they'll have a better education in a private or charter school education, but they will lose that funding because then it goes to the charter school instead of the public school, right? So you have that problem there as well.
Right. So yeah, it sounds like it's just a lot of loops that sort of spiral the problem
Oh yeah.
worse and worse.
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, what do you know about the states that are higher in education? So now, I mean, we've increased to what's our rank?
The last time I checked, I think we're like 35th,
I was thinking mid 30s.
mid 30s, around there.
So we've improved since raising teachers' pay.
Right.
And what are the metrics that they use to measure like 48th in education or whatnot?
tons of different things. They can base that on test scores. They can base that also just basically on pay, because you could correlate increased teacher pay, meaning that they are better teachers, which this is actually something that just is prevalent in the teacher world. We have a merit-based system, right? So the better the teacher you are, the more the school district deems you need to be paid more, right? So the higher qualification, the higher the degree, the more likely you are going to be better paid, if that makes any sense. So that's also the basis for comparing different states to each other. So if a teacher in Oklahoma, for example, this is not true, but if a teacher in Oklahoma example starts off at $40,000 and a teacher in Arkansas, a teacher in Arkansas gets paid $45,000, you could have the argument the teachers in Arkansas are better than the teachers in Oklahoma because they're being paid more right off the bat. They're better qualified.
And so they're kind of then reverse engineering almost the fact that they're paid better to mean that the merit has been applied.
Yes, the merit has been applied, even though that might not be true.
Well, it doesn't factor in, I assume, like cost of living.
Oh, yeah.
Because obviously,
Oh, yeah.
somewhere in California versus the Midwest, right, is going to
Absolutely
get paid a lot more over there.
Absolutely.
Just everything's higher there. So they may not have better teachers. But what's a state that is kind of near the top?
Near the top, I believe Pennsylvania's near the top. I think New York is also up there in California. I also believe, I think the number one right now, Alaska has to be up there too because they pay their teachers really well. A lot of teachers actually are flocking to Alaska and Texas, believe it or not, for lots of different reasons. So they're going to be moving up on the list. But I think if I remember correctly, I think Virginia might be the best right now.
So what does Virginia do then that puts them up there that Oklahoma maybe is doing now, but certainly wasn't doing in 2018?
Well, first of all, they're providing more for the classrooms, right? Because here's the biggest problem is teachers are having to provide their students supplies. They're having to use their own money to be able to teach the students, right? For example, there was a student in my school who came to school, didn't even have a backpack. Parents couldn't afford it, but they still needed to turn in tests. So the teacher would go out and buy pencils. And of course, since they have nowhere to store the pencils, no backpack, nothing like that, they would lose the pencils. So they would have to keep on buying more pencils. And that's an extreme case, but you have tons of different examples like that. Also, just the buildings themselves are worn down. That's going to be a big difference too, is that you're going to have better facilities, better buildings, better technological access in the east and the west, on the far extremes of the oceans, compared to here in the Midwest. A big complaint during the walkout in 2018 was that buildings were crumbling. Using my own school, for example, we had a giant section of mold in our gymnasium. And so every basketball game, it was like, nobody wants to stand near that section of the gym. And you could see the mold. That was the crazy thing. You could see how green and black it was, just growing up on the styrofoam ceiling. And it was like, is nobody going to do anything about it? But they couldn't afford to fix it. So that's a big difference. Is definitely the buildings. Another difference is that they already have a lot of infrastructure there. Human skills, that human capital, along with the physical capital that we've just talked about. But they have a lot of those human skills. They have those teachers who have made homes there that are dedicated to the region, compared to the teachers here. Because since we don't have that competitive pay, teachers are leaving. In fact, one of my favorite signs from the teacher walkout was Oklahoma's 3 biggest exports. One was oil. The next was beef. The third one was teachers. But it's true. It's if you cannot develop the community to keep your teachers, they're not going to stay there.
Right.
So that's another big problem, is that they have those communities for their families. That is a big problem that we don't have here. even now, looking at what Stitt has done with making all federal and state employees, or excuse me, just state employees, being able to teach, that's not going to help. I went on Twitter, and there was one state employee who was like, "Why would I leave my state job to go teach in a school where I'd be making less?" Right? It's
Right.
like, how is that going to help, especially with the time of during COVID? Because that's another big problem, is that teachers are leaving in droves because they're getting sick.
Mm-hmm.
Other teachers who are immunocompromised were just like, "Nope, I'm done teaching. I just can't.
Right.
It's too much of a risk," and that's another big problem. But that's a whole different thing that I don't know if you want to get into.
Well, and it's kind of, I mean, that's probably a problem everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
That's really, that's going to bring everybody, any one state now, maybe if they were looking at them back in 2018, they might be lower on the list than they are, but
Right.
that's kind of just a nationwide problem at this
Right.
point. But so Virginia, then, so, I mean, Oklahoma is just, it's not the best place to live, right? I don't know what our quality of living score is.
Here's the interesting thing about that. We are actually pretty cheap to live in compared to other states, and that's really because of our housing. The problem with living in Oklahoma, though, is, and I don't mean this to be mean, but it's a little bit true, is that we just kind of don't have a lot of infrastructure, right? Besides our biggest industries, and we only really specialize in very few fields. We specialize in natural resources like oil. We also ship off a lot of salt, thanks to the salt plains.
Right.
Water is also a big thing. The Ulaga water aquifer. Thank you. Jeez. We also ship off a lot of water. So those natural resources. Also, I'll just throw in there that we also 1/3 of our electricity comes from windmills, which is a fantastic. That's another natural resource that is renewable. Just to throw that in there. But also our agriculture, and that goes back to our history. But the agriculture is super big. Like, we do so much with beef.
Mm-hmm.
We're just like Texas. We sell a lot of beef. That's some of our biggest industries. And because those big industries have such a big foothold, it's kind of hard to open up other industries. And then, I'll be honest, Oklahoma is also very tumultuous with our weather,
Yeah.
which that can be detrimental when you're trying to open up other industries.
Right, and recruit people from other. That's
absolutely
the point I suppose trying to get at was somewhere like Virginia. I mean, that's just, everyone kind of has this positive thing associated when they hear Virginia, and they want to go live there, and it's
Right.
got such roots, right? It's such
Right.
a historical. Oklahoma's got a lot of history, but
Oh, yeah.
Virginia, for most people, that rings a lot more familiar. And so Oklahoma, I mean, I can see. I've lived here my whole life.
Right, and I've lived here my whole life too. An Okie from Muskogee.
Right. And so I know what it's like here, and I'm like, I can see how you wouldn't really want to come here. If you're here when you start, that's fine. But I know, so we have always struggled with budget, right?
Right.
That's a big problem in Oklahoma,
Right.
and it has been. You can probably tell me for how
Oh yeah,
long.
we've been struggling with money. It's actually quite interesting. Looking at how money has played its role, well, I mean, in all nations' history, but here in Oklahoma, because Oklahoma really is a history of fighting for resources and allocation of resources. Who gets what, right? That includes money, but that also includes land. That includes those human skills that I like to talk about. But that also includes like ideals, believe it or not. Like something that I'm very proud of Oklahoma about is the Oklahoma Standard. If you've heard about that.
It sounds maybe like it's a familiar concept, but explain to me what it is.
I bet the Oklahoma Standard is so ingrained in you that you don't even know what it is. That's because that's how Oklahomans just work. So basically what the Oklahoma Standard is how we react to certain tragedies, right? And just how we just generally are. The Oklahoma Standard was really a term that was coined after the Oklahoma City bombing, and how we responded to it. Like, to give you an example of the Oklahoma Standard, during the bombing, they had those search dogs out looking for people, and they did this on national television. They were like, we need boots, just any leftover boots that you may have that a dog can put their feet in, so they can go search in the rubble because their feet are getting cut up. They're not able to go too far to go find the people that they need to find in the rubble. And so Oklahomans sent in droves boots for these dogs. They had way too many boots after they aired that. It's insane how much resources we are willing to give for the benefit of others. That is our standard. Like during 9/11, for example, Oklahomans sent the most firefighters to go to New York to go help. During the wildfires in California, for example, many Oklahoman firefighters went there as well to go help fight the fires in California. That is just our standard. We are willing to sacrifice personal time for ourselves and other resources for others. That is our standard.
Yeah.
If you come to Oklahoma, I mean, you'll see it. If you have car trouble, someone is more than willing to pull over and help you. Right. We give a lot to charity and tons of different organizations like that. That is the Oklahoma standard.
It is a place filled with very kind people.
Exactly.
It is, there's things there's plenty of not to like about the state, but people is not one of them. I mean, really, it's a lot of nice people.
Oh yeah.
But sort of to refocus it back on budget.
Certainly.
We've struggled with budget for a long time.
Oh yeah.
And so I assume that I mean, maybe would it be fair to say that would be the biggest factor in education? Because I'm wondering what Virginia, and I just keep coming back to that one because that's when we said was at near the top.
Hopefully that's the first one. The first
it could
education.
be. It doesn't matter even if it's 10th. They're still ahead of us.
Right.
So I assume though that they don't necessarily have a whole lot more taxes, or like if somewhere like California is kind of famous for having a lot of taxes, but Virginia doesn't quite do that in my head, and so it might be similar to Oklahoma. And I wonder why we can't kind of spend the same amount and do the same things with education as Virginia.
Certainly. My take on that would be is we have more pressing issues in the minds of Oklahomans than education. Going back to 2018, but also now, a big part of our population needs health care, right? They need the Medicare, they need that sooner care that we hear all the time about. Because Oklahomans have a lot of pre-existing conditions. Also, a lot of our residents struggle with diabetes, other conditions like that. And so any allocation towards bringing doctors to the state is really needed, especially towards those more rural areas in Oklahoma, because that's a big problem. Is that we don't have enough doctors for those smaller cities that Oklahoma is kind of famous for. So are you going to focus on that, on keeping your citizens alive, or are you going to focus on giving them the tools to be better and bring more wealth and diversity into the state? Another big problem is that there's a lot of internal conflict in our state legislature. I've thankfully had the privilege to go up and shadow some of the senators. Sadly, haven't been able to talk to any of the representatives, with the exception of 3. So I guess I have. Besides the point. But I've been able to see all of the branches in Oklahoma play out the governmental process. And a lot of the problems always come from keeping families together, because a big problem here in Oklahoma is also prison reform. How many people are incarcerated? We have the largest incarceration rate of any other state. In fact, we have a larger incarceration rate than the rest of the United States. Women are being incarcerated extremely fast compared to many other places in the world, and that's destroying families. And so that's something that they talked about. So we need to keep families together, keep people healthy, and then up next would probably be education,
right?
Compared to other problems that the state is having.
Right. Well, it seems though to me kind of like a chicken and the egg debate almost, because it's like if you were to have better education, you would have, like you said, people that are smarter and then work and bringing in more money to then sort of help contribute to taxes that would contribute to healthcare, right? So it kind of seems like it's like you kind of one would eventually lead to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it is just a battle for what is most important in people's minds. Yes.
Certainly, yes. It's because to give you an example, during the walkout, my grandpa was so confused why teachers went on strike, why they walked out, and I told him all the reasons why, and he was like, "Well, I don't." He was basically just came to the point. He was like, "I think the education's fine where it is right now. I think the money needs to go to healthcare." Right, that was his take on it. I've talked to other people, and they wanted the money to go towards the roads, for example, all across the state. Just to bring that up, because I know some of your listeners who live here, even if they're not from here, have driven on the roads just here in Stillwater, and they're like, "Wow, this is completely different." And so that's another big debate: is we need to build that infrastructure, that physical infrastructure, back up in our state. And that's certainly a really good argument. It's just going back to what you said with the chicken and the egg. Is I'm going to make the argument that the egg that's going to bring everything else is going to be education. That's if you had to ask me. But certainly, I see the arguments of the other sides, which it's interesting bringing this up now in 2022 and seeing how far we have not come and how far we have come in both aspects, as especially here in college, looking at everything at the collegiate level and paying for education, how much different it is going to a public education, because we go to a public university, but I'm just thinking about how different it is going to TU, for example, to a private college, and how much different it's going to be there.
Yeah. Well, and see, I feel like I want to make the point that you want to be a teacher.
Oh, yeah,
so,
yeah. So I'm biased.
Well, of course, but this is my point. Is your grandpa is like, why education's fine? We need healthcare.
Right.
As an older person, I assume. I mean, they all have some sort of health problems,
Exactly.
and so that's what's going to be at the forefront of his
Right.
mind. And that's really all it ever boils down to is what's most important to each individual person, and that's what. And then you get enough people that kind of agree. And so I don't know, it's not really a question there, but I do want to then transition into sort of some history of teaching.
Oh, yes.
Because that currently things are doing better. We're getting better.
100%.
And I assume also, I mean, I think I agree with you still that the egg that would bring everything is education, because with better education, we'd have things like, that's linked to lower incarceration rates,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
If you have a more educated population, less of them would be in prison, and so I can see how that would be kind of that first domino that needs to be toppled. But,
right.
We're doing better than we were. How many? 4 years ago, 2018.
Yeah, 4 years.
Gosh, 4 years ago. So, but why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the history of teaching in Oklahoma?
Oh, yeah. Oh, teaching in Oklahoma. Yeah. So some of the first schools that were here would technically, the indigenous population of Oklahoma, the first people here, the Wichitas, had their own schools. If I'm starting from the very beginning, but their schools were really more of an oral tradition, an oral education, teaching through stories and physical actions. A more Western view of teaching really wouldn't come until the Spaniards, French, and eventually the English, in the form of Americans, start coming into the region, which is really quite fascinating to look at, comparing a non-Western education style to Western education. But to focus on what I know a little bit more about, which would be Western education in Oklahoma, we could really start off with the schools that the five civilized tribes had started in Oklahoma. Like the first school that comes to my mind, that's now a college now, is NSU, Northeastern State University. They started off as a Native American college for the Cherokees. They had one for women. It was the Women's Seminary School, where they taught them many different subjects. And then also the men's seminary school, or it's something similar like to that. I don't know if the actual name, just off the top of my head. But it's interesting because we're a land grant university, and you had many land grant schools open up, but that comes later. That comes later than where I am right now. I might as well just go there though, because OSU, is a land grant university. We were, we used to be Aggies, still are Aggies. Not to discredit any agricultural majors that may be listening, but it's interesting to see the shift in education, and that's what's fascinating from history, right? Because education in Oklahoma started off really focusing on educating human skills, like working farms, right? Looking at soil, almanacs, right? How best to, like, when to plant your farm, plant your crop, to start your farm. How best to keep your livestock alive. Those type of human skills. Also industrial skills, like making, plows, different things like that relating to agriculture. But now we have shifted to the history of today, working more in technological, skills, like IT skills, right? I know Oklahoma City is hiring tons of different people for IT jobs, as they need those technical skills that we've shifted from, right? It's crazy because that shift could be seen technically in the 20s, believe it or not. If you saw a shift from working on farms to making those factory jobs from like the 1880s after the land runs, or during the land runs, because that's 1889, all the way up to the 1930s whenever we started opening up more factories. Like, I know that we had big paper mills. You can also think of the oil booms and how we started shifting towards those industrial refining. So we still have those technological jobs then. Working in those more mechanical jobs is really a better word for it, before we start shifting to the more interpersonal jobs that we have today. It's really quite fascinating looking at that history. And then also high schools, the development of high schools is big because primary care was really what you had. But once high school started getting introduced during the late 1800s, in moving into what we have now, it's fascinating comparing the education of from the past to now.
Right. Well, so okay, how many education institutions were there before Oklahoma became a state? Just back when it was a territory.
Interesting. That's a really good question.
It may be something you don't know. I'm curious what type of things existed before 1907. That's when
right. Yes, 1907 is when we became a state. Well, OSU existed because we were founded in 1890.
Right.
I believe OU was here long before.
I think they were both the same year.
Yeah, but around the same year. Yeah. So you had those schools. But something that gets left out a lot in Oklahoma history is talking about the black townships in Oklahoma. Like Taft is a good example, the one that I'm very familiar with. But you also have tons of different black townships all across Oklahoma that have those that had schools for their children, and how they were preparing them as well. Like Langston, for example. Langston is a great example of a black township that has a college, Langston University, and how they have prepared their future generations for preparing. Well, back then, I'd be more focused on working on opening up their own farms. But now Langston has evolved into this beautiful community, into preparing their students for many different fields. It's interesting because there were big centers of education in Oklahoma back then, but not as much as we have today, which makes sense. But to give you an example how we valued education back then and how we still do is. The Oklahoma State, the Oklahoma Constitution, our state constitution, it specifically has a section in it that says that the state will give every school district bare minimum $5 to pay for their students per student, which back then in 1907 is a lot of money. And it just shows that how much Oklahomans valued education, because to my knowledge, no other state has that in their constitution.
Still,
it's not a guaranteed right. Not a guaranteed right. In Oklahoma, it is.
Interesting. Does that have any roots in the indigenous community?
Oh, absolutely.
Because I mean, you described
Absolutely.
they already had
100%.
education sort of set up
Oh yeah.
with their own traditions, and so
100%. Yes. To give you an example, the Chickasaws, whenever they had to sell their lands, they kept that money and invested a good chunk of it into education. And whenever the fight for statehood was going on, whenever they wanted to make the state of Sequoia for the Native Americans, a big part of that debate was what's going to happen with our educational centers, right? Because they knew that they needed to keep their culture alive. And there's different ways to do that. And they knew that through institutions, that's one way to do it. And so whenever statehood happened, that debate was going on even with white Oklahomans and also black Oklahomans and the many different people that lived in Oklahoma. They had that debate during that time. So absolutely, yes, it does come from the different tribes, but also from the people that had moved on in.
that makes sense. So I want to go back to the sort of timeline that you laid out of how education started. Obviously, teaching people useful skills for farming, and then it kind of pivoted, and now we're in a area of technology and interpersonal skills. I mean, it just sounds like education kind of teaches a society what the society needs to function and run in its current stage.
Oh yeah, so this is actually a really interesting point. This topic that you've brought up is really what it should be named is, what is the role of education, right? Is the role of education to teach the future generations certain morals that are very specific to our nation? Or is it teaching them thinking skills to be able to solve different problems that they may have just by themselves, but also for others? Mm. Also, should education be teaching them how to communicate with others? Should they be very individualistic, right? If that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. And honestly, if you look at how our education is set up, we have all of that. For example, teaching those morals, teaching how patriotism. We do the Pledge of Allegiance every single day in public education, but also at the same time, group projects. We learn how to interact with others. Technically, what you're doing for class right now, you're communicating with me. This higher level of education is teaching you how to be comfortable going out and speaking with others. You're learning those communication skills right now. Heck, I'm learning, bettering my communication skills just talking to you on this podcast. But at the same time, which section, which is more important, right? Should one be more important than the other? And that's the debate that we've had throughout the entirety of our nationhood. Technically, that is a debate that humans have been having since the dawn of time, if I'm being honest. But looking how we've tried to answer that, it's quite interesting to see how that has played out. Because one fact that I've also left out is religion also in schools. Mm-hmm. That's another big thing. Another big fact that I've also left out is sexual education. That's a big thing here in the South in Oklahoma. Even though I don't consider Oklahoma part of the South, we are part of the Midwest, but I'm not going to get into that.
Well, Texas just is so tall from like the Mexican border.
Right.
It got so deep that we're the second state from the bottom, but it's hard to call us South. But I see what you mean. But I do actually, because I thought of this when you were talking about some of the early things that we had. It was the women's seminary and like the men's seminary colleges. Is education, or are the roots of education often linked with religion? Because it seems like when I think about it, like the earliest sort of schools I can think of, because you hear a lot of like private tutoring for wealthy people mm-hmm. back, centuries ago, mm-hmm. but kind of collective education was like monasteries where they would mm-hmm. teach them those type of skills. Is that an accurate characterization? Yeah.
For many schools, they have started off related to religion. To give you an example here in Oklahoma, since I love talking about Oklahoma, as we have seen, Oral Roberts University, right? Mm-hmm. Very big Baptist university. Education like that has been all throughout the nation. Those schools start off with a religious view, but it's really fascinating to see as they go on that they start off they start becoming more secularized, right? But going back to the women's seminary school, that school in particular was not started with any religion in mind. That was just purely for teaching those labor skills that were needed, and also going into those extracurricular activities. With the exclusion of the women's seminary school, the other schools that were started, those very much were started as religious schools. In fact, one school that for the life of me, I cannot remember that's coming to my mind that I've read about was opened up back whenever Oklahoma was Indian Territory, was actually in the Choctaw Nation. A missionary school was opened up, and some Choctaw students went and they learned those values, but at the same time, they were also learning religious values at the exact same time, because they would learn how to read and write from the Bible, for example. That's a big thing. They would also be reading other religious texts. So religion and education has sometimes gone hand in hand, but surprisingly, because Oklahoma is a perfect representation of the rest of the state, in my opinion, because we've had all different types of histories. You can see how education has started off from a very religious point of view, but also from a secularized point of view. It's quite fascinating to see.
Right. So, but that's where we get even probably, is that even where we get values as part of the conversation?
Oh, certainly, yeah. You can certainly have the debate. It will. I don't know if you know about the court case Vitale versus Engel, is that the correct one? I believe that's. Oh, flip it. Excuse me. Engel versus Vitale. That is the one that is over religion in teaching religion in America, where if you talk about any type of religion, you have to talk about the rest, and you can also not have certain religious values overshadow the others. And that's where you get into that topic of separation of church and state,
right?
Because this is also another important facet of education. Is education a state institution, or is it more of a public institution where you get those values from again, right? Because you can certainly learn values from the state, but you can also get values from the public. What is better, right? Or is both good, or neither? Surprisingly, you can have that debate as well. I won't cover that though. So I do say that we still get some of those impacts today. Especially here, Oklahoma's in the Bible Belt, so you will get like a lot of in public school, for example, you will have outside of school activities based on Christian beliefs, right? But you can also have different clubs, those extracurriculars that are just completely secular, right? And you can learn morals that way. I've heard of atheist clubs, believe it or not, which is kind of weird hearing from, again, the Bible Belt region here in Oklahoma, but they do exist here in Oklahoma. Sure. It's really fascinating to see how students and how we as a community get our values and where we get them from. I guess it's funny, as I'm saying this, I sound more like the sociology and psychology section, even though I'm 100% talking about history and geography, just to point that out.
Well, I mean, I think that just speaks to the fact that, because my earlier question of does it dictate what you can or can't teach was based in the fact that I'm like, I mean, you're smart enough to do both. And so right. I was like, does it really limit you? And I mean, it sounds like it does a little bit, but I mean, you'd be fairly capable at teaching some of these things because you do know quite a bit.
Thank you.
So then what do you think about kind of private schools being often religious? I really feel like that's a big private school thing.
Certainly.
They are often based, often Christian, but just right. religious in general. Do you think that kind of fulfills the both that you're talking about, where the public institutions they're more like you have to teach all of the religions, and then the private kind of meet that need for some people that they have, that they want those values as part of school?
Certainly. I see exactly where you're coming from. And this really boils down to two different points, in my opinion. So a a more private schooling education, you are going to be in teaching those certain values that you want, right? And only those values. So to use an example, like a Catholic private school, right? The teachers, when the teachers go to teach there, they know which values they're going to be teaching, right? Because it's been standardized.
Mm-hmm.
They are going to be teaching those values, and the parents, well, I would hope the parents would know that those teachings and those morals will be taught there. The difference with public education, and what I think is so great about public education, is that you technically you how should I put this? You certainly get a set of standardized education, and you still certainly get morals based out of that education. But public education kind of leaves some of those morals to be taught by the parents.
Mm-hmm.
But public education, and this is what really makes it so great, will allow you to see everybody's point of view. You will learn about morals from other religions. You learn about morals from other cultures. You'll learn morals from different ideals as well, that can be read through books, that can be taught by teachers, also by classmates. You learn so much by interacting with others compared to whenever you go to a private school. Because at the private school, not to say at a private school that you can't learn about other cultures and other religions even, because I know there's theology classes,
Mm-hmm.
if I can speak correctly, that can be taught at private schools, looking at those different religions, but you won't get as in depth as you would from a public education standard, even on higher level education. Here at OSU, for example, we are exposed to so many different walks of life,
Mm-hmm.
and it is just fantastic to see. Because if I went to a private school, I'm less likely to see it. And in my opinion, being exposed to those different walks of life prepares you to be a better citizen in America, to be a better Oklahoman, to be better wherever you go, because you get those social skills. You learn just more about the world around you. You learn more about yourself and how you perceive the world compared to getting that private education. But here, the other argument though is that a private education, it will allow you to control what you want your students to know, which can be valuable if you don't want them learning certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Just to put that out there. And there's certainly that debate, and that eventually comes back to the parents. And technically the community, because we're all involved in the community, but
Mm-hmm.
really comes back to the parents. And that's the debate for you.
Right. Well, and I see that. I see that point of view, though, of kind of the benefits of public education. But that brings me to then the big question that you posed, and seeing if you have an answer. What is the role of education?
In my personal opinion, the role of education is to teach you certain set skills that everyone should know, but very basic ones, though, like reading, writing, math, 100%, critical analysis skills, to prepare you for whatever you want to do. I also think education is really needed to help bring out those social skills, because schools will involve you in your community with those extracurricular activities, but also just through field trips, going and learning and seeing the different world around you. So those social skills are super important, and also those more we also learn a little bit of labor skills as well, just growing up, especially now that we're in the technological age. We know how to interact with technology to some sense.
Mm-hmm.
Education also should give you some sense of morals, in a sense. Like, education should be able to teach you what is right and what is wrong to some degree, right? Back to the standard that we set as a nation, right? Because what is right and wrong will ultimately come down to you. But there are some things that society has deemed no, that is wrong, and you will 100% learn it in any form of education that you take, be it homeschooling, private, charter, public. You will learn those certain skills, and that's something I think is very important. And then lastly, and this is something that I think we've struggled as a nation, not just in Oklahoma, but as a nation, I do think that education should help a student kind of get the good push, a nice push in the direction where they kind of want to go. And that's hard, right? Because how would you know starting off, especially whenever you're in elementary school, what you want to do? I mean, because that can shift immediately. Like, I want to be a paleontologist whenever I grow up, but immediately you're like, no, I want to be a doctor. No, I want to be a veterinarian, right? I do think part of our educational standards should be helping students decide what they want to do, right? Because some people have better affinities toward it, but even if they have those better affinities, if they're not enjoying it, that's a job that they probably should not have.
Yeah.
Because then you have it, like, if you have a doctor that's not very happy performing surgery on you, I don't think I want that doctor. I don't want that to be my doctor.
Right.
So that's something that I also think education should have a hand in. I just don't know what degree yet, in my own personal opinion, we should have, if that makes any sense.
Sure. No, that was a fantastic answer. And I love that we got that answer out of you. I think we might have to call it there.
That's fine.
I can tell you've got a lot more to say. So
Oh, yeah.
I'll love to have you back on. But is there any closing thought that you want to share?
Certainly. My closing thought would be just look at how you yourself look at education, right? Because whenever you see how education impacts you and the world around you, you find where you fit in it. Because I've been discussing the role of the teacher and the role of the institution of education. One thing I've kind of neglected almost is the role of the student. How does the student play in your educational process? Because you ultimately define how you learn. Because, well, I know I got to make this fast, but if you're not engaging with your own learning, then you're not learning properly to a certain degree, because it's not going to stick. Another thing is, whenever you're looking at yourself as the role of the student, is also think about if this is really what you want to do, if this is truly what you want to learn. Because certainly you can be engaged with something, but if you don't want to learn it, then what's the point? Right?
Right.
So you have those two different aspects, almost the dualism of being a student, doing something because you want to do it, but also doing something because you don't want to do it, but you need it.
Right.
If that makes any sense. So my last remark would just really be looking at your own education, see how you value it, see if you enjoy it, and if it is necessary and essential to some degree.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my ending remark.
Well, awesome. Chris, thank you so much.
No, thank you. I had a great time on your podcast.
I had a great time too.